Hey folks, Matt Easton here. So I'm in another place this time. Where am I? I'm in historic Chichester. Now the first thing to mention about Chichester is it's a very pretty place. I'm very fond of it, but it's in West Sussex in the southeast of England. But as you might guess from the name, Chichester, Chester, anything with a Chester on it is Roman, and indeed not only was this a large Roman settlement, and there's lots of Roman stuff around here, but in fact some of the city walls are partially Roman. A lot of what's now standing and what you can now see is later restoration and reconstruction, but nevertheless the kind of outline of the city was set by the Romans. I'm actually standing on, you can just see behind me here, I'm standing on a large wall which is a lot higher than the surrounding areas, and this is a part of the outer city wall which would have stood around the medieval city of Chichester. And interestingly, underneath my feet is a powder store full of gunpowder ready to blow. There's no longer any gunpowder there, but when they came to break parts of the wall, and if I just turn around here, you can see down there are some steps, and then the wall carries on beyond there. And what's interesting is that when these kind of cities in England and all over Europe expanded, mostly in the 19th century, but in some cases earlier than that, they had to punch roads through the walls in order to make way for increased traffic, and as the towns and cities expanded. And so in lots of places these walls were pulled down, unfortunately, so there's not that many medieval walled cities where they still have the walls surviving. But in many cities there are still bits of walls surviving. Even in London, London still has some of the medieval, and in fact some of the Roman city walls still standing in London. A lot of people don't realise that. But that is the case here in Chichester as well. And you can see here that the wall carries on up there. There we go. But there's a gap in it where they've put a road through, essentially, and that happened in the 19th century, in the 1830s, I think 1838, I think I read. And when they did that, they decided this isolated bit of wall, which is here, they decided to utilise that as a powder store. So underneath here are arches, and they actually stored the garrison, the local garrison, and the city's store of gunpowder down there. Of course, because it's a good place to store gunpowder. You can keep it dry, it's secure, you can lock it up, and if it does explode, it's towards the edge of the city and inside a large stone building. Hopefully should reduce the amount of damage it does if a spark gets in there and it ignites. But let's go and have a little look at what's standing, primarily because I want to show you something that is over there, because not only do we have here some survival of the Roman city of Chichester and the medieval walled city of Chichester, but we've also got the remains of a motte. That's right, another Norman Motte and Bailey castle. Let's go and have a look. So here we go. I'm rather fond of this park, I have to say. So this is pretty much in the centre of Chichester, and you can see that it looks pretty much like a typical English park that you might find in any rather nice English town or city. But there's something quite noticeable right there, and that is the base of what was formerly a Norman motte or castle. Very interesting, but more than that, you can see that right the way around the perimeter here, up here, if I just stick my finger up there, going around here, is a bank with a wall on the top of it. And there is a sheer drop on the other side of that down to ground level, so that is a large wall. And I was formerly just standing up there, so you can see the break that's been made in the road here, and the powder stores is behind this Land Rover, and that is the outer city wall from medieval Chichester. Very interesting. So let's go and have a better look. It is of course worth noting that there is a medieval church built here. It is very common in castle grounds or fortified grounds to find some type of chapel or church, because of course, well, medieval cities were full of churches, and if you can put them in a secure place, so anybody based here has a church at hand, but also it makes the church itself safer and more protected from any sort of thievery or banditry. There's some squirrels gathering their nuts for winter. We're currently in the middle of October, so today's wildlife with Matt Easton. Right, but this is probably what most of you are more interested in. So large banks with a wall at the top. Now these banks are pretty damn large, and again, as at other sites I've visited and talked about, by modern standards these may not seem too massive to you. There's a bench for scale, so that's a typical park bench. But they are really, really big. I mean, the other side of that bank is a sheer drop and is a wall. Okay, so everything that you, stick my finger right here, everything you see here from ground level down here where the bench is, right the way up to the top of there, that is all wall on the outside of the bank. So the bank is piled up on the inside to support the wall, but on the other face there is no bank, it's just a wall. And that is a massive wall by medieval standards. That's as high as most church walls are, and most outer perimeter castle walls. That is a really, really serious wall, and to get over it, to scale it, you would need a long ladder by medieval standards. So it is a very serious wall, and that went right the way, as far as I'm aware, went right the way around Chichester. Very serious defence, and of course in a period where you occasionally get revolts and civil wars and challenges to the throne, all that kind of stuff. A city, despite the fact that it's in a country, and you think about a country as being part of a state and having a monarch and all that kind of stuff, the city has to kind of look after itself as well. And not only does the city want to look after itself, its residents and its tradespeople who live in it and guarantee its future and its fortune, but in addition to that, there were legal requirements for cities to maintain their castle walls, because at any time the French could turn up. And yes, okay, they didn't really. The French raided on the coasts during the 100 Years' War, but as far as I know, they never made it to Chichester. Equally, the Scots never made it this far south, thankfully. Well, unless you count the Stuarts, who of course became kings of England. Nevertheless, it was within everybody's interest to make sure that cities were protected, because they were huge bases, I don't know what the word is there, for wealth and taxes. And of course the crown drew a huge percentage of its taxes from the cities of England, and so it was within the crown's interest as well to make sure that the cities were protected so that they could extract the most tax from them, and the more tax they get, the more nice stuff they can buy and the bigger armies they can afford. Let's go up one of those banks and have a look from the top of one of these walls. Someone's conveniently put a ramp up here for us to climb up. Of course, there may have been ramps like this originally as well. Entirely possible. I don't really know. These banks are obviously here to support the wall. I'll tell you what as well, I've been talking about the outside of this wall. Let's actually have a look over this wall. Look at that. There we go. So I was not kidding, it is an absolute sheer drop down from here on the other side, and there's a road, there's ground level down there. So this is a really serious wall by Roman or medieval standards, and this is a large plot as well, a very large plot, and this wall is just immense when you think of the amount of work. Bearing in mind they had no machines, okay, they had simple cranes, they had wooden cranes, but for the most part this was done with hand, with manual labour. This is a huge undertaking when you consider, okay, so we're just looking at the fortified corner here, but when you consider that Chichester is there. That there is Chichester. Apologies for the wind. That there is Chichester Cathedral, that massive spire. So you can see, not only is it a large city by medieval standards, but it's quite far away from where the wall is here. Okay, so they have enclosed a huge area, and here is the Norman mound. So something that I find pretty amusing is this is now a playground, and that looks like it's part of the playground, that mound, and the majority of people who come here probably have absolutely no idea at all that it used to look like this, and that it used to be a castle. And I don't think that most kids that climb up and down this mound have any idea at all that that was formerly a castle, because it just doesn't look like a castle as most people think of castles. So this is a really good little placard. It tells us absolutely tons of information. So as it says there, the mound that you can see now up here is just a fraction of its original size. It would have been at least 4 times as big as what's there now. In 1066, obviously William the Conqueror won the Battle of Hastings, and he built a series of castles right the way across the country. These are called motte and bailey castles, where you have a motte, this is the mound, and a ditch around it. So the earth that's taken out of here is created to make the mound. What we can see now is there is no ditch remaining and the mound is smaller. So essentially the earth has eroded down and filled in the ditch that is around. They also at a similar time started building the first cathedral, which for anybody who doesn't know is what makes a city in England. So by law essentially a city is only a city if it has a cathedral in the medieval period. In more recent times it is possible for a city to apply for city status and become a city, but that's a more modern thing. So obviously there was an Iron Age and Bronze Age settlement before, so let's ignore that because apart from scant archaeology we don't know very much about that. AD 43, that's the important date for people to know. AD 43 is when the Romans turned up and invaded Britain, and they reckon that in AD 300 is when the Roman city wall was constructed. Now, I'm just going to talk a little bit into the camera. So, AD 300, what is that? So that's the late Roman period in Britain. Bear in mind that the Romans left Britain in the 5th century, that is the 400s. So AD 300 is late in Roman occupation of Britain. And what was happening in 300 and why were they throwing up city walls? Well, first of all, it's a period of consolidation for the Roman Empire. It's a period when the Roman Empire has pretty much stopped expanding and is therefore trying to consolidate its position and defend its position and shore up defences. And not only that, there is a very good reason why they have to do that, and that is because the Roman Empire is being assailed, is being attacked on all sides, and other empires are expanding, other people are migrating. People, you know, like Germanic peoples, Slavic peoples are moving around, and you know, people like the Huns as well. People are putting pressure on the edges of the empire such that the Roman Empire is forced to try and defend itself. Now, Britain, believe it or not, was a place that was being attacked at this time. And the people that we came to call the Anglo-Saxons, essentially, so the Germanic peoples, and they weren't just the Angles, the Saxons and the Jutes, we're also probably looking at Franks and Frisians, definitely Frisians, and we know this from archaeological and historical records. They were essentially pirates, raiders. They were similar to later Vikings, so it was kind of like a first Viking age. So if you imagine a first Viking age happening in the 4th and 5th and 6th centuries in Britain, that's pretty much what happened. And the Romans were forced to fortify all of their major settlements. This happened in London, on a massive scale, and if I remember correctly, they built, as well as the city wall around London, they built in the region of 60 artillery bastions on the city wall. That is large towers mounted with ballistae inside, so you know, giant crossbows and other forms of large machinery for shooting at attacking armies or indeed attacking ships, which of course London is on the River Thames, so it was often attacked by water, as was later happened in the Viking period as well. So Chichester is part of that, and this wall you can see behind me is part of, if I just scan around behind me, the edge of this park delineates the Roman fort, the Roman castrum that gives Chichester its name, the Chester, the castrum. And so, you know, quite simply, this was built as a Roman stronghold, and this is what we can see now is obviously later reconstruction, but this sits on the Roman wall. This was a massive Roman fortification, and not only that, but they built artillery bastions here. Okay, so this was an important settlement to the Romans, and they decided to defend it. We're quite near the coast here, so it was presumably subject to coastal raids from people who would later be known as the Saxons. So let's go back to that info board and glean a little bit more information. So as I mentioned, in the 5th century the Romans withdrew from Britain, and gradually the people, the Germanic peoples known that later came to be known as the Anglo-Saxons, took over control. Obviously there's a lot of debate about how many Germanic people moved and how much they intermingled with the native Britons, who essentially are the Welsh. But nevertheless, Chichester carried on as a important Anglo-Saxon settlement, and under Alfred the Great, so we're down here at AD 890, Alfred the Great made Chichester a burh, and that is a defence against the Vikings. A burh was essentially similar to an earlier Roman fortified town. It meant that it had a wall around it, and that wall had to be maintained by law by the inhabitants, and there were a certain number of men needed to give service in order to maintain that wall and make sure that it was defendable. Alfred, of course, greatly fortified Britain against the Viking attacks, and it was largely thanks to Alfred's efforts and building a navy and his successful military campaigns that the Danes were prevented from entirely taking over England. And of course he maintained southern England, Wessex, as a free Anglo-Saxon state, which eventually took back the Danish lands, or the Danish captured lands in the Midlands and the north of England, and created modern England essentially. Right, so the Norman period, this got built. So William the Conqueror came along, and as we see, Motte and Bailey, ditch, mound, palisade, and a keep, a wooden keep, much like we saw at Bramley. Therefore, as we can see here, because it was a wooden structure, there is nothing remaining of it now. It is just a mound, and an eroded mound at that. And the board reckons that this was 4 times larger than it currently is, so it was a very much larger mound than it is now. So in the distance there we can see Chichester Cathedral, which is very much worth visiting in its own right. I might do that on another day. And that was begun in 1076, but what now stands there visibly is a 14th century cathedral on the basis of a Norman cathedral. And Chichester continued to grow and became a great town. In the 14th century the Black Death unfortunately arrived and wiped out 1/3 of the population. Like many places in England, it was very, very heavily hit by the Black Death, and in fact all over Europe, of course. And it continued to be very important right the way through the Middle Ages, and of course it's still an important town today. But anyway, I hope that's been somewhat interesting to you, and I very much recommend you visit Chichester. It's a lovely place, and when you come to this park, now you will know it is not just a park with a playground. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe and feel free to follow us on Facebook.